Right now, inside a steel tank on a hillside most people will never see, billions of microorganisms are quietly tearing a fruit apart, and the next 24 hours will decide whether the coffee in your hands tomorrow tastes like nothing you have ever tried, or like something you immediately pour down the drain. The mountain is still dark when the first headlamp switches on. At 2,000 meters above sea level, on a slope in the central highlands, a farmer moves between rows of glossy, green shrubs, fingers searching for the few branches where fruit has turned the deep red of ripeness. Coffee does not ripen all at once. Each cherry reaches its peak sugar content on its own schedule, and a trained hand can feel the difference between a cherry ready for harvest and one that needs another week of sun. By the time the sky turns orange, the basket strapped across the farmer's chest holds nearly 20 kilograms of cherries, each one measuring close to 22 degrees Brix, the unit scientists use to describe dissolved sugar concentration in fruit juice. This sweetness is not decoration, it is fuel, and within hours it will feed an invisible workforce. The plant itself, Coffea arabica, traces its cultivated origin to these same Ethiopian highlands, and the story most often told of its discovery centers on a goat herder named Kaldi, who, according to a legend first written down by Arab scholars in the 17th century, noticed his goats becoming unusually energetic after eating the bright red cherries from a certain shrub. Whether or not Kaldi himself ever existed, the broader pattern is historically supported, that wild coffea shrubs growing in the Kaffa region were chewed for their stimulating effect long before anyone thought to extract a beverage from them, and that the practice of roasting and brewing the seed likely developed in Yemen by the 15th century, where Sufi monks used the drink to stay alert through long nights of prayer. From there, the plant and the practice spread northward into the Ottoman Empire and eventually across Europe. But the biology of the cherry itself remained unchanged, still governed by the same sugars and acids the farmer now measures by hand. Inside the cherry, beneath the thin red skin, lies a thick layer of mucilage, a sticky, sugar-rich pulp that surrounds two pale green seeds, protected by a tough parchment shell. For centuries, farmers in Ethiopia and later in Yemen discovered, mostly by accident, that removing this pulp changed the character of the seed inside, though nobody understood why until microbiologists in the 20th century identified the organisms responsible. The cherries are pulped by machine within hours of picking, stripping away the outer skin and most of the fruit, leaving the seeds coated in a slippery film of mucilage that refuses to simply wash off. That film is roughly 85% water and contains pectin, a complex carbohydrate that binds it to the seed. To remove it, the seeds are transferred into a fermentation tank, and from this point, biology takes over from agriculture. Inside the tank, naturally occurring wild yeasts, primarily Saccharomyces and Pichia species, begin consuming the simple sugars in the mucilage, while bacteria, especially Lactobacillus and Leuconostoc strains, work alongside them, producing lactic and acetic acid as byproducts. Together, these organisms secrete pectinase enzymes that dissolve the pectin bridges holding the mucilage to the parchment. The tank itself, a tall, cylindrical stainless steel vessel, roughly 2 meters high, holds the temperature near 22 to 28 degrees Celsius, the exact range in which microbial activity proceeds fastest without producing off flavors. Within the first 6 hours, the pH of the surrounding liquid drops from a neutral 6.5 toward an acidic 4.5. As organic acids accumulate, bubbles of carbon dioxide rise slowly to the surface, a visible signature of yeast respiration converting sugar into alcohol and gas. Technicians monitor this process closely, because fermentation that runs only 12 hours leaves mucilage still clinging to the seed, while fermentation pushed past 48 hours risks over-fermentation, where bacteria begin breaking down compounds inside the seed itself, producing harsh vinegary defects that no amount of roasting can later disguise. The discovery that timing mattered this much came slowly, refined over generations of trial and error, long before anyone could explain the chemistry. It was only with the rise of food microbiology in the mid-20th century that scientists could finally describe what farmers had always sensed by smell and touch, that a narrow window, usually between 18 and 36 hours depending on temperature and altitude, separates a clean transformation from a ruined batch. When the mucilage finally slips free under running water, leaving the parchment surface clean and slightly rough, the seeds are spread thin across raised drying beds, where sun and air reduce their internal moisture from near 60% down to a stable 11% over 1 to 2 weeks, a level low enough to prevent mold growth during storage, yet high enough to preserve the biochemical compounds that will later define flavor. What leaves the farm bears almost no resemblance to what eventually fills the cup. The pale green seed, still called a bean by habit rather than botany, is dense, grassy smelling, and almost entirely without the aroma anyone associates with coffee. That transformation belongs to heat, and to a chemical reaction that the French chemist Louis Camille Maillard first described in 1912, while studying how amino acids and sugars react when heated together. Inside an industrial roasting drum, a rotating steel cylinder heated by a gas flame beneath it, green beans tumble continuously as the temperature inside climbs past 150 degrees Celsius. Moisture trapped in the beans' cellular structure begins driving outward as steam, and the beans' internal sugars and proteins start rearranging themselves into hundreds of new aromatic compounds, a cascade now known as the Maillard reaction. As the drum temperature approaches 196 degrees Celsius, something audible happens. The bean's internal pressure, built from trapped carbon dioxide and water vapor, exceeds what its cell walls can withstand, and it splits open with a sharp crack. The first of two such moments in the roast known simply as first crack. The bean's color shifts from pale tan to a light cinnamon brown, and its volume expands by nearly 50% as its dense structure becomes porous. The roastmaster, listening as much as watching, tracks this moment precisely, because everything that happens in the next few minutes determines the final character of the coffee. If the beans are pulled from the drum shortly after first crack, the roast remains light, preserving more of the bean's original acidity and brighter sugars. If the roast continues toward 224 degrees Celsius, a second, quieter crack occurs as the bean's cellular oils begin migrating to the surface, marking a darker, more bitter profile favored in traditional espresso blends. The entire roast, from loading to discharge, typically lasts between 8 and 15 minutes, a window so narrow that a 30-second miscalculation can shift the result from balanced to burnt. Once roasted, the bean is allowed to rest for several hours as residual carbon dioxide continues escaping. Then it is ground into particles whose size determines almost everything about what happens next. For espresso, the grind must be exceptionally fine, close to 400 microns in diameter, fine enough that water cannot simply pass through but must be forced under pressure. This requirement led directly to one of the more overlooked inventions in food science history. In 1901, the Italian engineer Luigi Bezzera patented an early machine that used steam pressure to push hot water through compacted coffee grounds, but it was Achille Gaggia, decades later, in 1938, who introduced a spring-loaded piston capable of generating roughly 9 bars of pressure, 9 times normal atmospheric pressure, a force sufficient to extract not just flavor compounds but also the fine emulsified oils that produce a thick, reddish-brown foam, now known as crema. Inside a modern espresso machine, water heated to between 90 and 96 degrees Celsius is driven through a compact bed of 7 to 9 grams of finely ground coffee for almost exactly 25 seconds. In that brief window, water dissolves roughly 18 to 22% of the ground coffee's soluble mass, pulling out chlorogenic acids, caramelized sugars, melanoidins formed during roasting, and trace amounts of caffeine, while leaving the insoluble plant fiber behind in the spent puck. The pressure also forces microscopic coffee oils into suspension, where they trap tiny carbon dioxide bubbles released from the freshly roasted grounds, forming the pale golden crema that floats atop the dark liquid pouring into the cup below. What finally reaches the cup carries the signature of every stage that came before it. The particular yeasts that thrived in a specific fermentation tank, the precise second at which the roastmaster pulled the drum, the exact pressure and temperature dialed into the espresso machine. All of it converges into a liquid that took less than 30 seconds to extract but represents weeks of biological and chemical transformation. What began as a sweet red fruit on a highland branch, broken down by invisible organisms working in darkness, then rebuilt entirely by heat and finally drawn out by force, becomes, for a brief moment, something closer to engineering than agriculture, and yet entirely dependent on both. No. Single person designed this chain from beginning to end. A farmer who learned to read ripeness by touch. A generation of unnamed processors who learned by failure how long a tank could ferment before it spoiled. A French chemist explaining a reaction he never tasted in coffee at all. And 2 Italian engineers separated by decades, each solving one mechanical problem that the other had left unfinished. Together produced something none of them could have built alone. The steam rising off the cup in the morning light is the last visible trace of a process that began in darkness, underground, among organisms too small to see, ended in a few seconds of force and pressure, in a kitchen or a cafe, in the hands of someone who may never think about any of it at all.